Hello, everyone. My name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I've got a pretty interesting episode for you today, I think. I call it Stop, UFO, Don't Shoot. These are first-hand cases in which people have shot guns at UFOs. What happens when there's a UFO shootout? Well, it's pretty interesting, actually. I've got over 20 cases of this kind. I'd like to present them to you chronologically, starting with cases in which people have shot at craft and moving to cases involving actual humanoids. So I think this has something pretty important and profound to say about UFO-human interaction. So let's just get started. And the first case, the earliest case I could find, occurred in 1942. This is best known as the LA Blackout, or the Battle of LA, and this occurred on February 25, 1942, just a few months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And on February 25, 1942, the city of Los Angeles was invaded by several large UFOs hovering overhead. There was one particularly large craft and many smaller craft which moved in from over the ocean, over Culver City, and one of these craft stayed in place over the city for so long that the entire city went into an enforced blackout. And in fact, the military converged underneath this object, trained spotlights on it, and began to shoot over 1,400 rounds of ammunition at it in an attempt to bring it down, which was unsuccessful. However, 5 people did lose their lives due to heart attacks, falling debris, car accidents, this sort of thing. It's a very well-known event that has yet to be explained to this day. There was an initial cover-up. The press tried to call it balloons, but it became very clear that it wasn't balloons. I did talk to a first-hand witness who says that this was no way balloons. He saw one of these craft quite low in the sky. And more recently, documentation released through the Freedom of Information Act reveals that perhaps a couple of these objects were shot down, one over the Santa Monica Mountains and another over the ocean itself. So it's quite an amazing event in UFO history and did actually result in a congressional investigation and is perhaps the earliest known case of a UFO shootout, but certainly not the last. And in fact, in 1952, there was a huge wave of sightings across the US and the world. And Frank Ficino's book, Shoot Them Down, The Flying Saucer Air Wars of 1952, provides a gripping account of many cases in which the Air Force apparently vectored jets, fighter jets, after UFOs and tried to shoot them down, unsuccessfully apparently in most cases, though it's not entirely clear if perhaps in some of these cases UFOs were damaged. I do recommend Frank Ficino's book because it provides a really gripping account of how we used to shoot at UFOs, a policy which was apparently reversed after we had lost a number of pilots in these incidents. But moving on from there, there's quite a history of UFO shootouts. And the next case I'd like to talk about occurred in 1954. Off the coast of Bin, Korea. This was during the Korean War, and the U.S. Air Defense Artillery had several Hawk missiles set up in the event of an attack by the North Koreans. And at 10 a.m. one morning in 1954, a blip was spotted on radar moving towards a base, and the officers at the base sighted the object visually, which was described as, quote, a glowing metallic disc estimated to be 100 yards in diameter, 10 yards high, with red and green pulsating lights moving around the rim counterclockwise. Soon this craft approached within 700 yards of the base, when the captain of D Battery gave orders to launch a Hawk missile, which he did. But before it could reach its target, the UFO reportedly replied with a beam of white light, disabling the Hawk missile. The UFO then departed, making a sound like a swarm of bees. So this was a very interesting response from the UFOs in which they actually disabled the missile. And a similar event reportedly occurred in the Soviet Union in July 24 of 1957, when several UFOs were sighted over the Kuril Islands. The Russian anti-aircraft batteries went into action. However, the repeated attacks failed to bring down any UFOs. So people are not only shooting missiles at UFOs, but using handguns and rifles, such as what happened in the small town of Rio Vista, California. In May of 1964, the town of Rio Vista, which then had a population of about 2,000 people, experienced a 2-year-long wave of sightings. These objects were viewed by hundreds of local residents, and starting early in May of 1964, witnesses reported seeing a torpedo-shaped object, which was described as about 5 feet wide and 12 feet long, glowing bright red and moving silently at treetop level through the town. And in fact, it appeared so regularly throughout the month of May that residents were able to actually predict its appearance. Apparently, one resident was able to get a color photograph of the object, which she brought to the local sheriff's office. And this object would usually appear over a particular water tower about 5 miles outside of the town, where it would hover about 50 feet above the ground. One of the really dramatic sightings occurred on May 13, 1964, when an anonymous female resident said that she saw 2 objects, both described as round and luminous, and one of these objects came down and actually landed in a field. And by this time, many others in the town were seeing this object, which appeared again to be attracted to this water tower. At one point, 2 teenagers saw this object, and they took out their 22 rifles and actually shot at this object. And they are sure the bullets found their mark, as they could both hear a metallic twang as the bullets hit the metallic surface. The object flared up in brightness, but did not fly away, and continued to visit the water tower regularly for the next 2 years. And later, in 1965, another encounter would involve nearly the whole town and would generate interest from Air Force officials. So this is a case in which UFOs were shot at, but apparently caused no harm. And that seems to be a theme that turns up in a lot of these cases. Another case is that of Michael Campiador. On May 13, 1967, Campiador was near St. George, Utah. He was driving when he became aware of a strange humming sound. He pulled over, exited his car, and looking up, saw a huge object. He said it was about 50 feet in diameter and hovering directly over him. Frightened, he retrieved his .25 caliber pistol from his car and started shooting. And as in the Rio Vista case, he heard the bullets actually strike the target, but again, the UFO was not damaged. It just moved away without any apparent harm. Another case occurred later that year, on July 19, 1967, when Jack Hill, a 60-year-old night watchman for the Lumber Consolidated Company in Wilmington, encountered a UFO. He was patrolling the grounds when he observed a 50-foot-long metallic craft covered with lights hovering only a few hundred feet away. To his shock, this strange object zoomed straight towards him. He took immediate defensive action. His flight or fight instincts prevailed, And as he couldn't flee, he decided to shoot first and ask questions later. He drew his service revolver and fired 6 shots in succession at this object. And as Jack Hill says, and I quote, "Then the lights of the craft went out and it flew away." So again, the craft was apparently unharmed. Jack Hill was very impressed and reported his encounter to the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner. A really harrowing case of a UFO shootout occurred on the evening of August 30th, 1970. This occurred at the Funel Dam and Power Station in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The main witness was a security guard by the name of Almiro Martins de Freitas. So on that evening, Almiro was on the dam itself when he saw a UFO hovering over the dam. This object, he said, had about 15 portholes alongside the circumference. They were shining blue and yellow lights, and he quickly walked as close as he could to this object, which is about 50 feet away. Fearing that this UFO would cause damage to the dam, Almiro drew his gun and fired twice at the object. In response, this object whined loudly, flared in brightness, and then struck Almiro with a beam of light. This beam of light caused temporary blindness. And at this point, Almiro fired one more time. He says he heard all 3 bullets hit the metallic surface of the object. By this point, other guards had arrived and also saw this object as it moved away. Almiro was absolutely unable to see at this point and was rushed to the hospital, and he remained blind, totally blind, for 2 weeks following this incident until suddenly his vision returned spontaneously. A later investigation of the area where this UFO had hovered revealed that the cement dam below this object had been damaged. The cement was now powdered, cracked, and pitted with holes. This was not the end of the sighting. A few days later, on September 3rd, the object made another appearance over the dam. The guard on duty flashed lights at the object, which quickly darted away. And then 3 days later, on September 6th, the UFO came back for a third time. And on this occasion, 6 guards watched the object circling over the dam. They had been instructed not to fire at it, given what happened to Almiro, and this object eventually moved away. So yeah, this is a case which shows what can happen if you fire at a UFO. Sometimes they will fire back. Thankfully, Almiro's blindness was only temporary. But there are many cases in which people have used normal handguns to fire at these objects. Another case occurred on June 26, 1972, at Fort Beaufort in South Africa. Police came upon a UFO and fired upon, quote, a glowing metallic object from only 8 yards away, 25 feet. Upon being shot at, the UFO made a loud humming noise and took off. And although the gunfire did seem to chase the UFO away, it did not harm it. Here's another very interesting case which comes from researcher Brian Vike. This occurred on a January evening in 1976 when 2 men were driving along a remote dirt road on their way to go coyote hunting in the desert outside of Clovis, New Mexico. Ahead of them, they saw a bright green light at low altitude. They had heard of recent UFOs in the area, and they realized that they were seeing one for themselves. They drove forward and were actually able to drive right underneath this object, which they estimated was less than 1,000 feet high. They exited their truck to take a closer look, and as Brian Vike writes, and I quote, "Since the men both had rifles with them, the witness I talked to grabbed his .30-06 rifle and took a shot at the object and believes he put a round into it. As soon as the fellow fired and the impact of the shell struck the craft, it immediately started to move straight north." So these two men now found themselves hunting UFOs instead of coyotes. They hopped into their truck and followed this object as it moved towards the town of Clovis, New Mexico. And although they moved at top speed, this object easily outdistanced them until it was about 2 miles ahead. They continued to follow it until they saw a police car up ahead with its emergency lights flashing, and it was also chasing the object. And as they watched, this object shot down a bright beam of light, which completely flooded the squad car with light. At this point, the object darted upwards and was gone. As Brian Vike writes, he, one of the hunters, told me he sat quietly by because he figured it might have been a military aircraft and he just put a bullet into the thing, not wanting to get into any trouble over shooting it. Also, he mentioned he saw the object doing all these strange maneuvers, and he was glad he placed a bullet into it. Well, he got lucky that this UFO didn't shoot back, because as we have seen, sometimes they do. A very dramatic case of a UFO shootout with a jet fighter occurred on September 19, 1976, over Tehran, Iran. And on that day, a bright glowing object was seen by hundreds of people in Tehran as it maneuvered over the city. The Iranian Air Force scrambled 2 F-4 Phantom jets to chase this object, and the pilot of the first jet lost instrumentation and communication when he approached the object. The second pilot was General Parviz Jafari, and he watched this object dart around for more than 26 miles in less than a second, and suddenly a smaller object separated from the larger object. The smaller object headed directly toward Jafari. He instinctively fired at it. Immediately, all the instruments in his jet failed. The radio went dead, and as Jafari says, "I was very frightened." He wondered if he was actually going to have to eject when suddenly his instrument panel and radio began working again, and he was able to safely land. This was a very dramatic incident. As this UFO was starting over Tehran, people's windows were shattering. I talked to a first-hand witness. He said many, many people saw this. Hundreds upon hundreds of people saw this. It was a very dramatic display and shows what might happen during a UFO shootout. The UFOs will take action to disable the guns or the jet itself. Here is another very interesting case involving a UFO shootout. This case comes from Dolly Safran, who is actually the subject of my latest book, Symmetry, A True UFO Adventure. Dolly is a fully conscious contactee. She's been on board UFOs thousands of times, has spent many, many hours, years, months really, on board UFOs. And on one occasion, she had a very memorable experience when she was on board a UFO. She says on numerous occasions, people have actually shot at the UFO when she was inside of it. But one particular incident stuck out. This occurred in the mid-1980s, and as Dolly says, I was flying and we were coming down. We were going to pick him up. This was a gentleman. And as Dolly says, I think he might have been our target. He was outside and he pulled out his shotgun. He picked it up and aimed it directly at us. And I'm like, And I knew better than to panic or do anything like that. I'm well versed at what happens to people when they shoot guns at us. And it bounced. It ricocheted, and it hit him in the leg. And according to Dolly, this ricocheted bullet actually pierced the man's upper right inner thigh. The man Dolly saw now was really just a teenager, about maybe 17 years old, she estimates. He had a crew-cut hair, wore a t-shirt, jeans, high-top tennis shoes. And after this bullet hit him, his expression, which had been pretty determined and angry, transformed into one of shock, fear, and disbelief, and he fell to the ground screaming. This bullet ricocheted accidentally. This was not something the ETs did. And as Dolly says, we had to pick him up and take care of it. They had to remove the bullet and fix it. And I think what they were going to do that night didn't get done because they were busy taking care of him. He was also on board for a long time, like a day or two, before we brought him back. And he was brought back within time. Do you know what I'm saying? There was no time for him. He didn't know at all what happened. In other words, his memory of this event was suppressed, and he was brought back to within minutes of when he had first seen and shot at this UFO. So probably not a good idea to shoot at this UFO. After this man was taken on board, the ETs healed him of what is essentially a self-inflicted bullet wound. And usually they will just beam a person back into their house. On this occasion, they landed and physically walked him back into his house. And again, this was not the only time Dolly had been on board a craft when someone had shot at them. Normally on these occasions, if the bullet strikes the craft, it normally just pings harmlessly away. But on this occasion, the bullet somehow ricocheted back at the witness. So this is what happens when people shoot at UFOs. And people have not only shot at UFOs, they've shot at humanoids. And this can become even more dangerous. And I think some people in these cases actually regret shooting at these UFOs. One early incident occurred on November 14, 1954, over the town of Isola, Italy, when a local farmer watched as a cigar-shaped craft landed nearby and disgorged 3 small beings dressed in diving suits, which promptly surrounded his rabbit cages. Fearing for his animals, the farmer quickly retrieved his gun and aimed it at these invading dwarfs. And at this point, something very strange happened. His gun became, quote, so heavy in his hands that he had to drop it. The farmer now found himself unable to move or cry out, and he could only watch helplessly as these small little beings took his rabbits and returned to their craft. And as soon as it lifted off, the farmer could move again. He quickly squeezed off a round of bullets, but the object was now too distant to have any discernible effect. So probably the most famous UFO ET shootout of all times occurred on August 22nd, 1955, to the Sutton family of Hopkinsville, Kentucky. On that evening, one member of the family was outside when he saw a glowing object landing in a field behind the house. He ran inside to alert the family, and moments later, the entire family saw a 3-foot-tall humanoid creature with huge eyes, ears, and clawed hands approaching the house. And then suddenly, several other of these creatures appeared at once, and the alarmed family ran inside. One of the creatures appeared on the roof of the house and actually grabbed at one of the family members. At this point, Frank Sutton, the father of the family, fired a shotgun through the screen door at one of the creatures. According to Frank, it was a direct hit, and the creature was knocked over by the blast. However, it instantly jumped back up and scampered away. And these creatures continued to terrorize the family for the next hour or two until finally the family piled into their car and drove off to the police. The police and the family returned to the location, but at this point there was no evidence of the creatures. The police left, and shortly later the creatures came back. The family remained locked inside their house while these creatures roamed around inside and finally left hours later. This is a very famous incident in the annals of ufology, and it's been recounted in many UFO books. And as always seems to be the case, these aliens were not harmed in any way by gunfire. Another very well-known case involving a UFO ET shootout occurred on September 4th, 1964, to a hunter by the name of Donald Shrum. He and his two companions were hunting in the wilderness outside of Cisco Grove, California. Donald Shrum became separated from his companions and lost. And as evening approached, he realized he was going to have to spend the night outside. And knowing that there were bears in the area, he decided he was going to climb a tree and spend the night there. And shortly later, he saw a strange star-like object in the sky. It dropped down until it was very low, and it quickly approached him, and he saw that it was actually a craft with 3 strange panels on the side. Before long, he saw a smaller craft, which was ejected from one of these panels, and this smaller craft actually dropped down and landed about a half-mile away. And it wasn't long afterwards that Donald saw a strange figure approaching him. He said this figure was about 5 feet tall, helmeted with large goggles, and wore a white uniform. It came to the area where Shrum was in his tree and began to examine the manzanita plants. And shortly later, it was joined by another figure, and shortly later after that, 4 more figures. At first, they did not seem to notice Donald, but when they did, this is when the shootout began. A strange robot-like figure approached and began to emit noxious gas to try, apparently, to get Donald out of the tree. It didn't work, though it did render him momentarily unconscious. And Donald tried to keep this figure away by throwing down burning matches and bits of cloth. He actually threw his canteen at them at one point. I did have the opportunity to meet Donald Shrum face to face. I actually held the canteen in my hands, which was really quite an interesting thing to be able to do. He's a very sincere man. I'm absolutely convinced this incident did happen. There is, in fact, a book written about this incident by Ruben Uriarte and Noe Torres. At any rate, this robot-like figure was not discouraged and continued to try to dislodge Donald Shrum from the tree. And fearing he was about to be abducted, he took out his bow and arrow and began shooting. This was a large bow and arrow, a 60-pound recurve bow with a 28-inch pull. And at close range, the velocity of this arrow is comparable to a bullet. And as Donald Shrum says, I tried shooting the robot with my bow. I just pulled it back as far as I could, and I hit him the first time. There was a big flash of light. The robotic figure fell backwards about 10 or 20 feet. And at the same time, the uniformed humanoids retreated and scattered. And as Donald Shrum says, I guess it scared them a little. But it did not scare them off, because shortly later this robotic creature returned. Donald shot 2 more arrows at it. Each time there was a bright flare of sparks as the arrow struck the metallic body of this robotic figure, which again fell backwards several feet. Unfortunately, the arrows weren't able to keep the robotic creature away, and it returned each time. Luckily for Donald, however, their technique to dislodge him from the tree did not work, and eventually they left, returned to their craft, which joined the larger mothership, which took off shortly later upwards and disappeared, and that was the end of that. But it was a very dramatic, hours-long shootout in which this hunter shot a bow and arrow at this robotic-like creature, which again apparently did not harm it, but was sufficient to keep it away from him. Some cases do have a real tragic ending, such as what happened on August 13, 1967, in the state of Goiás, Brazil. The main witness in this case is Inácio de Souza and his wife Maria. They had just returned to their home to see a giant object, which they says was about 35 meters, about 100 feet in diameter, which had landed on their property. They described it as a strange object shaped like a basin, only upside down. And as soon as they saw this object, they also saw three, quote, strangers that Inácio first thought were nude. However, his wife Maria thought that they were wearing tight-fitting yellow suits. These figures were all slender, with bald heads, and these figures immediately saw that they were being observed and ran straight for this frightened couple. Inácio de Souza told his wife Maria to run inside, and he took his gun and shot at the nearest creature. At that moment, they fired back, and Inácio was struck in the chest by a beam of green light and fell to the ground. His wife returned and grabbed the rifle. All three intruders then quickly returned to their craft, which took off vertically with the noise of a swarm of bees. Following this incident, Inácio became quite ill. He experienced extreme nausea and full body numbness. His body felt burning hot and weak, and his symptoms progressed and became worse. Finally, he went to the doctor, who said that he must have eaten a noxious plant or something. Inácio said no, told the doctor about the UFO encounter, which prompted the doctor to order more tests, including a blood test. And the doctor was shocked to discover that this blood test revealed a condition very similar to leukemia. And Inácio de Souza was told that he had about 2 months to live. And as the doctor predicted, Inácio, his condition worsened rapidly. He lost weight, became sicker and sicker, and in less than 2 months, he passed away. So yeah, that's a tragic case, somewhat of an outlier, but it does show that perhaps it's not a good idea to shoot at UFOs. Another case occurred in October of 1973, and this involved a gentleman by the name of Paul Brown, a car dealer from Georgia, who actually may have prevented his own UFO abduction. This ordeal began as Paul was driving late at night, and his radio suddenly became filled with static. At the same time, a bright light lit up the interior of his car, and moments later a strange craft, about 15 feet in diameter, landed ahead of him on the road. Paul Brown skidded to a halt and watched as two creatures exited the UFO and began to walk towards him in his car. And Brown described them, and I quote, "They were about 4 feet tall. They looked like they were wearing silver uniforms, including their shoes. There was some elastic at their ankles, and their suits were closed tight at the neck also. They had silver gloves, and their hair was solid white." Fearing he was about to be taken by these beings, Paul grabbed his pistol from his car and aimed it at the aliens. These ETs apparently noticed this, quickly turned around, returned to their craft, and as they entered into this craft, Paul opened fire on the UFO, which promptly took off. So he got lucky in that case that they did not take any action back at him and just left the area. Also in October, that same year, on October 18, 1973, truck driver Eugenio Douglas was nearing Monte May in Argentina when he was stunned and temporarily blinded by a bright beam of light coming from above. As he pulled off the road, he saw a glowing disc land on the highway, and four things like shiny metallic robots exited the craft and moved towards them. Realizing that he was about to be abducted by these beings, he grabbed his loaded revolver and fired point blank at the advancing entities. The bullets, however, seemed to have no effect on them, as he said. So he says, I took off running across the countryside. Eugenio fled towards the nearest town, and as he did, this disc actually followed him, swooping low overhead. And as Eugenio says, and I quote, each time that disc made a pass over my head, I felt a blast of roasting heat. And by the time he made it to safety, huge blisters had formed on his back. So while this case is famous for the injuries suffered by the witness, fortunately his injuries were not fatal and he recovered. Some people have not only shot at aliens, but at Bigfoot as well. And a very famous case occurred in Fayette County in Pennsylvania in October of 1973, when the local police received a series of calls concerning UFOs. And three witnesses said they actually saw a ball of light land in a nearby field. One of the witnesses was Stephen Meacham. He was armed with a .30-06 rifle, and he and two friends went to investigate, and upon approaching the area, they saw two hairy creatures in the field. So whether these were Bigfoot or just hairy ETs is hard to say, because this does come in conjunction with a UFO sighting. But at any rate, Stephen Meacham fired 3 rounds of ammunition at them, and it had no apparent effect, though he is positive the bullets struck the creatures. They turned, looked at him, but did not noticeably alter their pace. The police were called, and a single officer was sent to investigate. Stephen Meacham and the officer encountered the creatures face to face, and again, Meacham started shooting at them. As Stephen says, and I quote, I shot directly into the chest of the creatures. It swayed backwards and then came right at the fence. Again, the bullet did not seem to harm the target, but as Stephen says, I had to hit them, but it didn't faze them. They kept the same gait. They never hurried. So again, we have cases where these bullets strike the creature directly but does not affect them. A very similar incident occurred 1 year later on February 6th, 1974, and again involved a Bigfoot-like creature. This occurred near Uniontown, Pennsylvania, when a witness by the name of Miss A heard what she thought were wild dogs. She ran, got her 16-gauge shotgun, and went outside, and was immediately confronted by a, quote, 7-foot-tall, hair-covered, ape-like creature standing just 6 feet away. This creature raised both of its hands in a threatening gesture, so the witness fired the gun into the creature's midsection, and the creature reportedly, quote, just disappeared in a flash of light. The witness ran inside, and her son-in-law, who was living next door, called her on the phone. She told him the story, and he ran outside armed with a 6-shot revolver. And as he approached his neighbor's house, his mother-in-law's house, he saw shadows of 4 or 5 hairy people with fire-red eyes that glowed. He fired 2 shots at them to no apparent effect. He ran inside, and at this point his mother-in-law spotted a bright red flashing light in the woods a short distance away. So this is again a UFO Bigfoot case, also involving a shootout in which the entities were not apparently affected by the guns. So there are some very interesting cases in which people have tried to shoot at ETs and were defeated by very mysterious means. One such case happened on July 15, 1979, to a couple in San Antonio, Texas. A couple sighted 3 large glowing balls of light right outside their home, and as they watched, 5 creatures described as, quote, thin, with grayish skin, large hands, and large oval-shaped slanted eyes descended from these balls of light. The man ran inside and got his shotgun, and at this point, both the man and the woman were overcome with sleepiness. Later, under hypnosis, they recalled a frightening abduction scenario. However, at the time, they experienced only a period of missing time. After firing at these objects, the next thing they knew, they were waking up in the morning to find the shotgun completely dismantled, laying on the kitchen table with all the parts spread out. So evidently, the ETs had taken the gun and pulled it apart for examination. And as usual, this weapon had no effect and certainly did not, in this case, prevent the apparent abduction from taking place. Another UFO Bigfoot shootout occurred again in Pennsylvania at Point Isabel in the fall of 1988. In this case, 3 men sighted a Bigfoot-like creature outside their farmhouse, and they decided to go out looking for it. And sure enough, they came upon it. One of the men, Arnold Hubbard, was armed with a .22 rifle, and he saw that this creature was only 50 feet away. So he quickly took his .22 rifle and fired at it. He believes he hit it because this creature let out a, quote, hideous scream. He fired 2 more shots, at which point this creature became enveloped in a white mist. The mist dissipated and the creature was gone. Another one of the witnesses, Larry Abbott, said, and I quote, "The 3 of us searched the spot where the creature was shot that night. We found no trace of it, no blood, nothing. Next day, we checked the whole farm. Nothing." So this is what happens when people shoot at UFOs, or for that matter, ETs or Bigfoot. Nothing. Usually nothing happens. The UFO will simply dart away, though in a few cases they will shoot back. I did cover most of these cases in my book, Not From Here, Volume 1, except of course the case involving Dolly Saffron, which is covered in my book, Symmetry. So as these cases show, the ETs are very advanced to the point that bullets are probably not going to have an effect, certainly not on their craft, and very rarely on the ETs themselves. But at any rate, I think these cases show that it's probably not a good idea to shoot at a UFO. For one reason, you're not going to damage it. Second, there is a possibility that it will shoot back at you and perhaps even cause physical damage. So that would be my recommendation. Don't shoot at UFOs. This is something our military apparently learned early on and reversed their policy. And I think this is good advice. Don't shoot at them because sometimes they will shoot back. And I think these cases show how truly aggressive humans are, because in no case, not one, did the UFOs shoot first. It was always the humans who shot first, and if the UFOs shot back, it was only in response. So there you go. This is what happens when people shoot at UFOs or ETs. I think it shows more about us than about the ETs themselves. We are far more hostile than the UFOs. So that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Once again, I want to thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. And until next time, keep searching for the truth. And more importantly, keep having fun.